of Education, to Queensborough President Donovan Richards. And I know we have a packed event tonight and meeting, but we do want to express our gratitude and appreciation for you all making the time here today. Just so you all know, we do have a question and answer portion after both presentations. So please feel free to put that in the chat box. And now I would like to introduce the Queensborough President, Donovan Richards.
Thank you, Kat, and good evening to all of our parents. Hope you're enjoying. I know the kids go back tomorrow. I know that my son is looking forward tomorrow, I think so, to getting back to school after the spring holiday, certainly. So God bless each and every one of you, and God bless you with endurance and patience. That's all I could say. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight, as we hope you and your families had a wonderful spring break. We have another packed and eventful Parent Advisory Board meeting tonight. Our meeting will focus tonight on the federal COVID-19 stimulus funding New York City public schools received in 2021 and its impact on our communities and most marginalized communities. We are honored to have representatives from both the New York City Independent Budget Office, I want to welcome them, and the Emergency Coalition to Save Education program here. They will share their research and answer any questions that surround the investments that went towards positively impacting our communities. For a brief background, New York City public schools received over $7 billion in federal funding to initiate or sustain educational program as temporary relief efforts. This fund is set to expire in June 2024, and these temporary funds supported the fruition of doubling access to 3K for thousands of families across the city, supporting our students in temporary housing or English language learners, programs related to special education, as well as hiring mental health counselors and nurses, and many more impactful resources that should not be deemed temporary. Let me say that again, should not be deemed temporary, but permanent and further invested in. Although Mayor Adams recently announced a $500 million allocation to make portions of these costs permanent, we still have much more to do when providing our students the education and opportunities they deserve. We know that many of these programs have been largely disinvested in or overlooked within communities that need it the most. And I will say that we're putting our money where our mouth is in terms of trying to fill those gaps. I've invested close to $53 million as borough president, with a huge emphasis in ensuring that many of these communities left behind certainly are getting resources. Many of the schools, including the schools that I went to myself, who have not seen their libraries touched or their auditoriums touched, or the need for more STEM and programming for these education centers. So we are largely focused on that as an administration. And when we think of, and let me say, to start us off tonight, I had the pleasure of introducing research experts from the New York City Independent Budget Office, who released 2 publications on this matter. They will discuss a piece of their findings, including an overview of the programs funded by these funds and the larger implications and future of these programs. So as we're in budget negotiations, all of us should be making our voices heard. I know we are certainly doing that. We have to lay out our budget priorities, and education is a big piece of that every year to counter cuts to our system. And I will also remind folks that there are more asylum-seeking brothers and sisters in Queens than any other borough. I have 50,000 in my care, and I'm seeing some announcements by the Biden administration, at least alleged announcements, that we will anticipate more coming in the days to come based on what we're seeing in the Middle East, and we'll be following up on that. But we know Queens is the melting pot, so we certainly will be at the forefront as these things happen, and we want to ensure our schools are being fully funded. So I'll introduce, so we have from the IBO, we have Taina Gora, the Chief Outreach and Engagement Officer, Julia Conrad, the Assistant Director of Education, Yungwan Song, the Lead Budget and Policy Analyst for Education. And we will have Q&A portion following this presentation tonight, and we'll be taking questions on these particular topics tonight. But if you have questions on any other issues impacting the system, please feel free to reach out to Kat Zapata, my Director of Education, who will share her email and certainly be monitoring the chat tonight. So thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the presentation. Thank you, Kat, for all the work you're doing. Thank you all who have shown up to hear and to learn more. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, VP. Taina, Yangguan, and Julia, please feel free to share your screen now. And thank you for being here to start us off this evening.
And thank you for that introduction. I'm just here to give a quick introduction as Yangguan and Julia get the presentation ready of who the Independent Budget Office is. We are a nonpartisan city government agency, and our primary mandate is to provide independent revenue and spending estimates. So we provide our own projection of what revenue is going to be coming into the city, and we also estimate what spending we foresee for the year coming up. And they differ from other outfits that do similar projections, such as OMB and the comptroller. But another one of our primary missions on top of that, like mandated work, is to help the New York City public understand public policy and budgetary matters through our independent analyses. And that's what we're going to be presenting on today. We've gone and looked a lot into, we've been tracking what the federal funds in education, how they've been spent by the administration. And that's what Julia and Yangguan are going to talk to you today. And I just encourage you to ask questions. And if in the future you have questions, get in touch with us, or Catherine has our information. We are a public resource, so we hope that you'll use us.
Great, thanks, Tina. So I'm going to start us off a little bit with the agenda. So we're going to talk briefly about what is IBO. Tina got us started, and then a little bit about generally the New York City education budget. Then I'll pass it over to Yangguan, who's going to talk specifically about COVID stimulus funds, and we'll have time for some questions. So first off, what is IBO? As Tina said, we are a city agency. We're nonpartisan, so we don't make policy recommendations, but our reason for being is to help provide information to New Yorkers on what's going on in their government and the services that their government does. So we do that through mandated reports, but we also take requests, and we take requests from elected officials, from the public, from community groups, from parents. And those requests can be big reports and big analyses, and they can also be clarifying questions about what's going on in their school district. So we have a kind of an interesting story on the education team that I just want to highlight, as has been much in the public conversation this year about mayoral control. Our history is tied a little to that too. So in 2002, New York state law abolished the 32 local school boards, and mayoral control of the schools began. IBO already existed at that point, but when the renewal of mayoral control came up in 2009, there was some concern that there wasn't an independent voice to give some kind of analysis on what was going on in New York City schools. So there were calls for IBO to fulfill that role. So we already existed as an education team, but at that point, our team took on an even bigger responsibility, which is to be that independent analysis of what's going on for New York City schools. So to give some examples about what we do an evaluation of the city's budget, and we also do research on students, on teachers, and on schools. So some recent topics that we've talked about recently are teacher retention, the number of bilingual teachers and bilingual programs in New York City schools. Where are those programs located? We did a big research study on the costs of New York State's class size law. We've also looked at COVID stimulus funds and where they have gone to programs, which programs had funds. And I know we'll talk more about that tonight too. And we've also looked at the history of funding for 3K, which has had a really complicated and nuanced budget history. So we keep on doing research, but a lot of the reasons for what we look at come from conversations we have with the public. So we're always listening, and we're always curious to hear what others are thinking about and interested in, so that that can guide our research as well. So I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of the New York City education budget. How are schools funded? They come from different sources. So one of the big chunks of the budget for New York City schools comes from city funding. Generally, city funding is coming for schools from income and corporate taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes. For the 2023-2024 school year, which matches to a fiscal 2024 year, the New York City schools budget was $39.4 billion. So of that total $39.4 billion, 53% of those funds was coming from New York City. So New York City was paying 53% of the total. New York State was providing funds for the 36% of the total. COVID stimulus funds, which we'll be talking about tonight, was 6% of the total budget. And then an additional 5% came from other federal sources. So think of places like Title I, Title III. And then it's not quite zero, but it's less than 1% are other sources of funds too. So those might be private sources or philanthropic. So this gives kind of a breakdown so you can see the scale of those different shares over time. So this bar graph is going from 1990 all the way to 2022. We have not yet updated it for 23 and 24, but we will soon. And what we're seeing here is the breakdown between city funds, state, and federal. And what I want to point out first is that all of these dollars are adjusted to be in 2022 dollars. So the scale here is consistent. And what you can see is over time, that blue bottom bar, that's the city funds, is increasing. So from 1990 to 2022, the city funds are increasing over time. The state funds, that next teal bar, it increases a little bit, but not as much. And then that final bar is the purple one, that's federal sources. And that's really what we're focusing on tonight. And I want to point out two places on this timeline. So first, if you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Oh, here it is. Okay, so that's 2008. And then following that in 2010, you'll see that purple bar got bigger. That's additional federal funds that came to the city after the Great Recession. And then if you look all the way at the end of the timeline, you'll see the purple bar gets really big again. This is the entry of those COVID stimulus funds that are coming into the city budget. So that purple share, the share of the total budget that's coming from federal aid, increased in those two time periods and then decreased again in between. So if we were to extend this, we'll see that purple bar be big for another couple of years. And then what we're going to be talking about tonight is what happens when that additional federal aid is going to expire. The last thing I want to share is sort of background before Youngwon gets specific into the city budget, that I wanted to give a sort of a sense of where we are in the year right now in terms of budget negotiations, which the borough president mentioned earlier too. So there are 4 financial plans released every fiscal year. What's kind of strange is that the city's fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. So July 1st is the start of a fiscal year. And the adopted budget is due before June 30th. So that's kind of the final budget action that we'll see happen, and it's coming up ahead. And throughout the year, there are also budget modifications. So those are changes or updates to the budget, and they always happen in the same sort of general time periods of the year. So that's November, January, and April. So what we just experienced a week ago was that executive budget, April budget, and that is usually to reflect the changes to the state budget. So the state budget is negotiated before it's finalized, and then the executive budget reflects those changes. So that's where we are right now. The next budget action ahead will be the adopted budget in June. So what you'll see over the next couple of weeks are a lot of city council hearings and negotiations between city council and the mayor's office and others who are participating in that process, who are negotiating for the finalized adopted budget, and that will be for the fiscal year ahead. IBO does reports throughout the year, so we do a whole agency-wide report in November and January and April. Our report will come out in about 2 weeks. So we're deep in our analyses. We're really, really looking into the most recent executive budget, which means unfortunately we can't share all of our analyses since we're still really digging into it right now. But what we'll be able to present tonight is what we've done so far and what we're seeing, the kinds of questions we're asking. But I will caveat by saying that we haven't finished all of that analysis yet. So there might be some things that we can't answer tonight, but we will be really excited to share and follow up with you once we have finished that analysis. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Youngwon, who's going to talk us through the COVID funds. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Youngwan and the lead budget and policy analyst in education team at IBO. And today, I'm going to talk about the COVID fund, the general background of the COVID stimulus fund, and also the trend to show that the COVID stimulus fund effect on the DOE expenditure total, and also a specific program. For example, today I brought the community school programs, and then I will talk about the IBO work, the previous IBO work to reprice, the estimate how much the city fund need to replace that COVID stimulus fund once that funds expired. So let's start with the general background, how much and when the stimulus fund came to the New York City, and also until when the funds have to be used. So between 2020 and 2025, the New York City received roughly $8 billion in the federal COVID aid. And many people used to these names. So there are the federal level acts. Those three acts is authorized some fund, the stimulus fund to support the New York City. The first one is CARES Act, and the second one is CARSA and ARPA. Still, I don't remember the full name of this act, but people use this short version. So these three acts passed a different timing and a different amount of money. So first, the CARES Act passed on March 2020, right after that the pandemic start. And then the CARSA Act passed December 2020, and the ARPA passed March 2021. And then these all three funds, the registrations, they have the due date to use that fund. And as you can see in this chart, so the New York City and the DOE have to use the CARSA fund and the CARES Act anyway, at least this year, the fiscal year. So end of this fiscal year, the DOE have to use, and also ARPA as well. But actually, the ARPA, the end date is the next year, but almost all ARPA fund also used until 2024. And I cannot say the exact number, but about $200 million in the budgeted 2025, but we will have to check it too. So yeah, so when people say the COVID fund, that is authorized by these three, the federal act, and also sometimes people heard about ESSER fund, so ESSER funds, but that is not the separate the roles. That is just the fund name that came through these three acts. So there are ESSER funds, but that is just the name of fund or something like the bank account. But that all the stimulus funds backed by these three federal acts. Okay, and the next slide. So this slide shows the general information about how those COVID funds support the personnel service. So the the full-time position. So for example, the ARPA fund as of March 2024, the 609 pedagogic positions and 25 non-pedagogic positions and 10 education professionals. And these COVID funded positions include the school social workers and psychologists and guidance counselors and therapists and the speech teachers and administrators. Yes, so the personnel all involved in the programs, initiatives that are supported by the COVID fund. So in general, we could expect, okay, the after expiration of COVID fund, definitely this personnel service also might be affected by the end of the COVID fund. The next slide, next slide. And beyond that, the personnel service side, this slide shows how the DOE used the COVID fund. So IBO identified the two groups of the initiatives that supported by the stimulus fund. So at the beginning, the DOE, they budgeted all those about $7 billion for about 60 initiatives, 60 individual programs to use that COVID stimulus fund. And also IBO identified two groups. The one group is a long-term expansion and restoration, or we could say recurring programs. So for example, it's a 3K expansion, summarizing and mental health for all, and preschool special education and community school expansion, pathway expansion, and contracted nursing, restorative justice patient. So these programs, we consider this program is not temporal program to support for students just led by the COVID pandemic. So we think these programs have to be continued by the DOE. And the other group is a short-term recovery effort. So we identify these groups as, okay, this program is just for that COVID pandemic. So once the pandemic done and the money is only for that recovery effort. So for example, it's academic recovery, student support, and special education service, information technology, because the remote learning during the pandemic, and also some part of money, the COVID stimulus fund used for mid-year adjustment, hold harmless. That means the individual school's budget, there is something decrease, then the DOE also used this COVID fund to support that the school level's budget, and also summer school. So from the beginning, the IBO, we tracked all the initiatives that support by COVID stimulus fund by these two groups. Next, yes, this chart shows then, okay, so what happens when COVID aid expire? So before saying that, this chart shows the general trend in the total, the DOE budget. So x-axis is the fiscal year, y-axis is the dollar amount in the $1 million, and the blue bar is the actual expenditure, and the light blue is the budget expenditure, and also that orange part is our part that is actual or budgeted expenditure funded by COVID stimulus fund. So in general, we can say, okay, anyway, after the expiration of COVID stimulus fund, the DOE budgets continue to grow, as you can see here. But the point that I want to say is here, anyway, this yellow, the orange part, the COVID stimulus, is really substantially increased the total DOE budget from 2021, 2022, and then continue to 2024. And then here, we are interested in the gap between the previous, the COVID era, and also after here, 2025 and 2026. Even though the general trend is increasing, but we are not sure how well the increased city funds support the programs that previously backed by the COVID stimulus fund. Okay, and then the next slide, I just picked one example, that is a community school budget. So this chart shows, okay, the fiscal year and also budget. And also we used a different data source. So these are all the budget amount. And then the orange part is all fund from federal government. So this data didn't identify separately the COVID fund or others, but in general, the total amount of federal fund. But these figures, anyway, just shows that total federal funds, including COVID stimulus fund, for the community schools increased substantially in 2023 here. So definitely this driven by that COVID fund. So based on this chart, we can say, oh, after the expiration of the COVID, the stimulus fund, then what happened? What will happen? Then we say, okay, this big part of about over $50 million gone. Of course, not 100% because there are other federal funds still, but still we could expect, okay, there is fiscal cliff after this 2020, 2024. So that is the common sense expectation. And then the next slide shows, okay, so once we got the November and the last November and January plan released by the city government, the IBO tracked whether the city put their city fund or other fund to support the community schools. Because to fill that gap, right? The yellow part of the previous slide. Until January plans, there is no full the fund to support the replace the COVID stimulus fund. But right now, in the recent executive budget, the city allocated new fund to support the community school budget by 2 items, the community schools and the restoration of a community school pack. I can say the financial plan, the city government make the pact to reduce the budget size for community schools. But now in executive budget, they restored that pact to $8 million for our years. And also community school is $48 million. So in this community school, as I already said in the previous chart, the orange part is roughly about $50 million. And here in total is $56 million. So I cannot say exactly, but generally we could say, okay, at least in the community school program, there is no total substantial fiscal cliff, but city make some effort to replace the COVID fund by the other fund. And the next slide shows, yeah, this is really complicated, but I just want to introduce our IBO work and also executive budgets briefly. So IBO has tracked all 60 programs that planned by DOE to use the COVID fund. And then the previous January plan, we re-estimated how much money the city allocated for that COVID stimulus funded program. So these are the example programs and all others. I don't want to focus on this detailed number. You don't need to see that because this number is already outdated because executive budget released. But the point that I want to say is we tracked and the IBOs kept the repricing the program's cost once the COVID fund expired. And then now this column shows the checklist, how the executive budget recently released, they cover these programs. So here is the red check mark is the city put the money. So this column is only for 2025. And then these two is out years as well. So preschool, special ed, they put the money for all the coming years. However, the 3K expansion and art-related program, they just allocated 1 year budget. And then we also asked to OMB and DOE, then we will figure out the more details later in our report. But anyway, this checklist shows that what programs the city put the more additional fund to coming years. And here, the total amount is the $514 million for 2025 and the $316 million for the coming years. And then here, our estimate for 2025 was $489 million, and then out years, $654 million. Still, there are gaps between our estimate and the newly released city budget. So that's the part IBO right now working on, and then we will publish our analysis about this number. So we will estimate this number, our version, and then we will show the gap between the New York City, the budget, executive budget, and our estimate. Yes, so these tables shows our previous work and what areas that we are working on. And then we will shows the number estimate between still our budget and the city budget. So so my presentations end. Thank you.
Great, so we have time for questions, and I also just want to put our contact information too before we take any questions, because we love to hear from everyone. So if we don't answer a question tonight, you can see our emails are right here. That's the best way to reach us too. But happy, Kat, to take questions however makes the most sense.
Yeah, thank you all so much for that. That was great. We will have questions. Any questions that you may have, please put them in the chat box. You should have chat capacities. I know we have a couple hands up. So if you can please put them in the chat box and remember for them to be, okay, we have Sasha Cruz. Hi, Sasha. So we have her saying, I see no funds are allocated for Summer Rising for 2025. Do we know why this is missing?
Yeah, so that's definitely an area that we're looking at as well. I don't think I have seen, I'm just looking quickly at my appendix. This is from the mayor's press release, and I haven't seen any additional ads for Summer Rising. So that's a great example of, and I'll go back to Yanwan's table. Summer Rising is an area that IBO has been tracking. We know there were federal stimulus dollars put into it. So we are continuing to look at that program. I'd say any of the programs you see here that don't have any checks next to them, that's an area that we're going to be looking into much more detail to try to get a sense of what that represents for the program. What does that mean in terms of actual services for families, for students? But as of now, we didn't see any new ads for Summer Rising in the out years. It's a great question.
Thank you for that, Julia. And we can definitely follow up, and I'm sure Chelsea and Molly for our next presentation will be covering that. If I'm not mistaken, Summer Rising has helped thousands of families, right? And we know that it was very competitive even this summer to even get seats along. So that is definitely something that we hope to hear more about and to really be expanded on, as the borough president noted earlier. We have another question that says, can special education programs take advantage of the COVID-19 funds? If so, how?
Yeah, so there were quite a few additional, there was COVID stimulus funds used towards preschool special education. And there were, as you can see in this table right here, there were some new additional funds added in where we think there was a gap. So they're very specific, and we're really trying to tease out what those funds are for. So I can't give a total answer yet of what this new budget information means for special education. In terms of how programs take advantage, I will say IBO put out these budget videos on our website. They're called Budget Basics, and they really walk through how to look up specifically what is the budget at your school and what are the kinds of programs that exist at schools across New York City. So if you're interested in learning more about what kind of ways the city is funding special education, there's a ton of resources, and we do these videos where we walk you through step by step how you look up your school budget, how you understand what programs are being funded at your school, and how you can look at a list of where all the different places that funds are flowing into schools, to try to get a sense of what's out there. In terms of how you advocate for it, that's a little out of our scope, but we are very happy to help show anyone how do you understand what's currently being funded at your school or what's being funded citywide.
That's awesome, Julia. Thank you. And I'll definitely add that link as well in my wrap-up email to the parents in case they want, a little bit more specificity on that school, and we can definitely follow up in that capacity. But that's awesome to hear. I see that we have a couple hands up. For those individuals, please, if you could add your question here in the chat box. So our representatives from IBO can answer them. We'll give it another minute, but I know, okay, we have another question. It says, not every school administrator is as savvy in ensuring dollars are maximized for our children's school? How can we hold them more accountable? I'm not sure if IBO has an answer for that, but open.
Yeah, so we don't make recommendations, but what I will say, so I was a DOE teacher before IBO, and I served on my school leadership team as a teacher. And I'm imagining maybe some parents here are part of PTAs or school leadership teams. And I would say that that's kind of a space that it's structured for you to have conversations around the budget with your school administrators. I would recommend watching, I know I just plugged them, but I would watch our budget basic video so you can look up the information yourself on what is going on in your school budget and use it as a tool, basically a set of tools to have conversations. Have them with your school administrators, with your superintendents, at community education council meetings. I'd really recommend like the knowledge is power route. And we are here to help you sort of understand what are very, very complex, sometimes totally impossible to understand public documents. And we would love to do that. And the other thing, this is a perfect segue too, we are available to give presentations. We have one specifically on how to look up your school budgets. So the videos are there, but we are available. So if that's something we've presented at a lot of community education councils, and if that's something that you're part of or another community group that you're part of and we would love to come share more. So we can kind of give that walkthrough in person, which is sometimes a little bit easier than the YouTube video, but it's a great resource as well.
Great, thank you for that. That's great. And I know there's some questions on how parents could better advocate for their funding. We do have, again, representatives from the Emergency Coalition to City of Education programs next, who can talk more about that. But we'll definitely, once again, continue to share the representatives from IBO's contact information in case they want to follow up on a specific school or a resource. We will also include the link. The link, I believe you said, is Budget Basics, right, Julia? So we'll include that as
yes,
well.
That is it. And I just want to say, I see Lorraine in the questions mentioned Yolanda Smith, who taught me a lot of what I know about budget work. Yolanda used to work at IBO, so it's wonderful to see someone mention her name in the chat. That's great.
Great. That's awesome. Then we have a question on sharing a specific budget details for Forest Hills community, Forest Hills High School community. We can definitely follow up offline and share the direct contacts here to IBO so they can follow up with that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, I'll give it another 30 seconds. But on behalf of the borough president, we want to thank you all for being here. Tina, Young-Wan, and Julia. This has been extremely informative. I know we have next Molly and Chelsea from the Emergency Coalition to Save Education programs, but we really want to thank IBO for their extensive research when it comes to acknowledging education-related matters. We definitely want to continue to build the bridge for our parents to know, become aware, and more engaged. I want our PEP appointee, Shirley, if she wants to say a couple words or just say a hello, and then we'll segue on to Chelsea and Molly. But thank you once again, IBO.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shirley Oben. Thank you Kat for the introduction. I am here as the Queensborough president appointee to the PEP. Thank you for IBO for coming here and sharing with our families and the community about the budget. And that at this point of concern, there's a lot of concerns about the budget, about education being cut. And along with this office, we always want to add more money to education. We don't want cut funding. So please share your ideas, share your concerns, and the way you want to see more funds being spent more effectively, and to make sure all the services and opportunities and resources that our children will receive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. So now we have the Emergency Coalition to Save Education programs. We have representatives on the coalition's behalf. If I'm not mistaken, last time I read, there's over 170 organizations who have signed on to express and save the important New York City education programs and services and the personnel positions that are currently supported through these temporary fundings that IBO expressed and that will expire in June. Chelsea and Molly, I'll let you take it from here. Please let me know if you have access, but thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Kat. And thank you to the Queensborough President Office for allowing us the opportunity to have the conversation. Also, as a budget nerd myself, shout out to IBO for that very thorough and detailed presentation. I think it actually helps us segue pretty easily. And also shout out to everybody that's, watching wherever you may be on a Tuesday night on such a nice day too. It's so important and empowering that we have these conversations, especially as they relate to our school communities, our districts, just because I feel like education is power. So thank you for having us. My name is Chelsea Badamore. I am Director of Policy and Advocacy for the YMCA of Greater New York, and I am one of the co-chairs for the Government Relations Work Group for the Emergency Coalition to Save Education programs.
And I am Molly Senek. I am the Education and Employment Community Organizer for Center for Independence of the Disabled New York, and I am on the Government Relations Committee for the Emergency Coalition to Save Education programs. All right, and I'm just going to share my screen so we can get started.
Thanks, Molly.
No problem.
So as IBO, so beautifully laid out, over the last few years, the DOE received roughly $7 billion from the federal government in COVID-19 relief funding. So the DOE used some of this funding to meet temporary needs caused by the pandemic, such as helping reopen schools after remote learning, additionally, or to pay for funds for things like PPE. But DOE also used around hundreds of millions of dollars per year to meet long-term needs that existed before the pandemic and are not going away anytime soon. And so, as IBO pointed out, this ranges from funding for expanding 3K to hiring social workers and other school staff. And we're here to talk about how the city should have been investing in these programs all along and how we will certainly need to find a way to continue and sustain these programs in the out years, not just the next year, but the year after that. And as IBO mentioned earlier, the DOE expects this funding to run out by June, but that doesn't mean that the needs that our school communities has is going to go away. So here's a picture of some of our coalition folks. So the Emergency Coalition to Save Education programs is fairly new. We actually all came together last summer to sound the alarm about the potential for devastating cuts to numerous education programs as the COVID-19 relief funding comes to an end. And as Kat mentioned, currently we have more than 170 organizations that have signed on to our call to action. And we've been urging elected leaders to save education programs funded with these temporary federal dollars. And while we have testified in Albany and have mobilized a lot on the federal and state levels of government, currently, we've been partnering with City Council to really focus on our city advocacy now that the state budget has been passed. And we've also been fortunate enough to organize some incredible town halls in each borough and have mobilized students, parents, and educators as we continue to get the word out there that this is happening. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that education on the issue is powerful because like the last thing that we want to happen is we come around come fall and we hear about all of these programs that are gone. And so many parents, community leaders, students, staff themselves, they're not aware of what's happening, right? And we don't want it to be a conversation after the fact, which is why we've come together. We want to be proactive and not reactive. So a city budget update, just like IBO mentioned earlier, Originally, when we scheduled this presentation, we thought that we were going to be presenting to all of you a very long list of programs that are on the chopping block due to the expiring federal COVID-19 relief funds. The good news is, though, that last week the mayor released his executive budget, which includes a big $600 million for key education programs that are currently funded with the expiring federal dollars. However, while the city has committed to continuing a lot of these programs, and we really appreciate that, the work is there's still a lot of work to do, right? So some of the education programs that were funded were left out of the mayor's announcement. So we still have programs that are on the chopping block. Furthermore, other education programs are funded only with city tax levy dollars and for 1 year only. So that means that while, yes, we'll be able to continue funding for some of these programs or staff, right? The following fiscal year, we have to start the budget fight all over again. And then other education programs were actually baselined with state foundation aid to cover some of those gaps, but they're still facing cuts on the city side based on all of the pegs that were proposed in either November or the preliminary budget. And we'll go through some of the individual programs to give you some clarity, because like I know that IBO broke it all out, but like until we go piecemeal, it just seems like a lot of numbers and a lot of things. So the $600 million that were in the executive budget proposal, right, include funding for 3K and preschool special education programs, Summer Rising, nearly 500 school social workers and psychologists, more than 100 community schools, learning to work programs, 100 shelter-based community coordinators, literacy instruction and dyslexia programming, bilingual education programs, translation and interpretation, as well as a lot of other programs. So this is not an extensive list. And again, like I mentioned, we're so grateful for the investments that were made, but there's still so much work to do. So we're going to look through some of the specific programs that are still at risk of budget cuts, and then maybe flag a couple that may have had some sort of funding to cover the gap, but give a status update on where they are at. Okay, so 3K and pre-K. So while the city has restored $92 million for 3K to make up for the loss, the mayor is still proposing to cut city funding for 3K and pre-K by $170 million. And that's combined with what was in the November plan as well as in the preliminary budget. And I believe that the $92 million off the top of my head, that was funded with CTL dollars. So again, it's for 1 year only. So when we're looking at fiscal 26 and 27, like we're still facing those cuts in the out years. Okay, so then preschool special education, the city used temporary federal funds to support preschool special education. And while the city has agreed to continue most of this funding, there continues to be a gap. So meanwhile, we have more than 600 young children with disabilities that are waiting for seats in their legally mandated preschool special education classes, and thousands of preschoolers are still waiting for services. And then I'll talk about community schools before I pass it to my colleague, Molly. So the DOE actually used state foundation aid to plug in $48 million of the fiscal cliff, right? And that's baseline, which is great. It's about 113 community schools across the city. They also use state foundation aid funding to cover an $8 million peg that was proposed and baselined in the November plan. So on one end, again, we're super grateful to get all of this funding for community schools. However, community schools as a whole, again, citywide, is still facing somewhere between $14 and $21 million of a gap. And that's a mixture between city council negotiated one-shot funding, some of the pegs, and then also just a lack of clarity as far as what the actual spend for community schools is on the federal stimulus funding cliff side.
Okay, thank you so much, Chelsea. So we've talked a little bit about things that have been partially funded under the executive budget. And now we're going to talk about certain things that were left out of the executive budget completely, starting with restorative justice practices. So this year, the DOE is using about $12 million in temporary federal funding to fund restorative justice practices, which allow more schools to use alternatives to school suspensions, which obviously keep students in the classroom and which lead or correlated with higher educational attainment levels and lower chances of encountering the legal system, either as a juvenile or as an adult. So restorative justice practices have been shown to really make an impact. They keep students in the classrooms and they help them build and repair relationships. That $12 million of federal funding represents the majority of the city's investment in restorative justice. And that is something that, as of right now, has no continued funding in the executive budget and is going away. Similarly, we have the mental health continuum. The mental health continuum is a cross-agency partnership that helps students with significant mental health needs access expedited mental care. It is funded with 1-year city funding, about $5 million, and that funding is expiring in June, again, unless it is extended. And this is something that was also left out of the executive budget, despite both the city and state administrations making such a big push for better mental health care, and especially better mental health care for youth this year. Something else missing is immigration, family communication, and outreach. So more than 40% of students speak a language other than English at home. This program helps immigrant families get key information about school, and there's only about a $4 million funding gap. It is funded with 1-year city funding, again, expiring in June, unless it gets extended. Student success centers, which allow trained youth leaders to build a culture of college going in 34 high schools and help their peers with the college admissions process. So this year, the DOE is using $3.3 million in temporary federal funding to support these student success centers. And again, this was not mentioned in the executive budget. So students don't have to lose these programs, right? Because at the end of the day, budgets are about priorities. And as Chelsea, as we all have been saying, we are incredibly grateful for the $600 million that is going to continue these programs. But it's just as important to continue these other programs too, and not to forget them and not to get caught up in the win, because the thing is, at the end of the day, all of these programs are interconnected. Like if we're talking about, it's wonderful that we were able to save about 500 school social workers and family workers. If we cut restorative justice, we are only going to need more of them. You know, it's wonderful that we restored bilingual services, but at the same time, we're cutting bilingual outreach. So those things need to be prioritized going forward. And the clock is ticking. As IBO said, the city budget deadline is in June. I know it feels like April. It is April 30th. Tomorrow is May. As of tomorrow, we have a month plus to make sure these programs are included in the adopted budget. What is this? A way to get involved? Scan this QR code if you are interested in some of the advocating to save these programs. We know that a lot of people have been coming to information sessions like this. We know from the beginning that there were people who were interested in what we can do to save some of these programs. So next week, a week from today, on May 7th at 6:30 p.m., we are doing essentially a next step version of this presentation where we are going to talk about the things that we learned, and we're probably going to go over this a little bit just in case anybody needs a refresher. And then we are going to talk about next steps, what next steps we can take. We're going to start talking about actionable steps to try to save these programs. So I'm going to leave this particular QR code up for another minute or another few seconds, and I will also drop a registration link in the chat. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds just in case anybody wants to scan that. All right. And then speaking of next important steps, so on May 15th, there is going to be the education budget hearing at City Council. The public testimony is going to start at about 2:30, I believe. If you scan this QR code, you can register to testify either in person or on Zoom. You can also submit testimony in writing and just include how important all of these programs are. Every program that we mentioned, whether it's getting partial funding or no funding at all, please let City Council know where you stand on this. So that takes us to if anyone has any questions.
We'll give parents and members here a couple minutes, but Chelsea, Molly, thank you so much. This has been extremely helpful. And we thank you for your advocacy, all that you've done this past year in really securing the funding when it comes to our students and their educational longevity. And we know that this has a larger impact when looking at the numbers and how many students and families are actually in conjunction with the support systems and levels that the funding has allocated. So thank you so much. We'll give, I think we have a question here. Are vendor programs allowed funding from this?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, you cut out.
Oh, sorry. It says, are vendor programs allowed funding from this?
So I think the landscape of the funding that we're looking at is for services that have already been it's not like a bucket that we're looking to expand programs, right? It's a bucket of funding that was utilized to already bridge gaps that existed. So like for a little context, at the time when this funding was utilized, I was at City Council Finance, so I remember being on the other side. So what we were looking at was an economic landscape where the city as a whole made decisions to make cuts to schools, right? Whether that meant like on a school level, the way IBO presented it, right? Whether it meant school cuts on individual like school levels based on like enrollments and other factors, or like larger citywide initiatives that were already funded, like let's say community schools. So these were contracted services, or these were funds that were utilized to hire staff or to fund existing programs. It's not necessarily a bucket of funding that we're looking to support new programs or even like swap funding, because again, the big issue here is that this is not sustainable. This is temporary dollars. I hope that that helps clarify.
Thank you for that, Chelsea. Do we have any other questions? I want to reiterate that we will be sending a follow-up to this meeting. So we'll definitely have everyone's information as well as the 2 events and invitations that Molly and Chelsea alluded to on how you all can get more involved. So we'll definitely include that there. But we'll give it a couple more minutes to see if there's any other questions. I know it's the last day of spring break, so once again, thank you all so much for being here. I know also our great New York Mets and New York Knicks are playing right now, so people are definitely, it's 7 o'clock, so they're hitting other events they may have. We'll give it another minute. I think we might be okay. So once again, I will follow up with all the participants here with my direct email as well as all the presenters. But thank you so much to Chelsea, Molly, Tina, Julia, and Youngwon for their support here in making sure that you as parents and leaders of organizations are aware of this federal funding that is coming out the pipeline. We thank you all so much for your time, and we'll definitely follow up. And as the borough president mentioned, this should be a time of investment, not disinvestment in our communities. So thank you all once again, and please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank you.